Welcome back to the Swamp 24/7 podcast. I'm Thomas Goldkamp here with Blake Alderman. Blake, I did an episode Sunday kind of breaking down my thoughts from the game, so we've talked about the USF game quite a bit. Obviously, there's a ton to talk about this week with Alabama coming to town, the number one team in the country. Only the second time that Nick Saban has brought his Alabama team into the Swamp. And obviously, Florida in year 4 under Dan Mullen is in a place where the program seems ready to potentially take the next step. Now, I think there's a lot of fans that would tell you that next step may not be in week 3 against Alabama. It may be further down the road against the Georgia or maybe even a rematch against Alabama in the SEC title game. But what I want to do with today's episode is really take a look at where Florida is at now in year 4 under Dan Mullen, and then talk about the importance of this game. And we can debate what that is, whether or not it's a game that could potentially push Florida to the next level or set Florida back. I have thoughts, on both of those scenarios, depending on how the game plays out. But I wanted to get your take. In year 4, obviously there's some narratives out there with the fans, and we cover, the Gators for a recruiting-centric site. That's kind of our bread and butter. So I know that we tend to look at Florida through the veil of recruiting in a lot of ways. And I think it's fair to say, Blake, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that a lot of the hardcore recruiting fans have question marks about where the program's headed under Dan Mullen based on how Florida's recruiting right now. Basically, long and short, is Florida recruiting well enough to eventually be able to consistently compete with the Alabamas, with the Georgias? I'm not going to throw LSU in that mix anymore because they look pretty bad. But I think, so there's this underlying dynamic with Florida where it seems almost everybody agrees Dan Mullen's a really good game day coach. Dan Mullen is an excellent developer of quarterbacks. But also, most people agree Dan Mullen's not a great recruiter. And I think the real question mark comes, where is that kind of line? Where does the tug of war finish there between that recruiting and that really good game day coaching, that really good ability to develop quarterbacks and develop really all players, I think. Where do you stand on that in year 4? Like, where is this program for you? Obviously, Dan Mullen's elevated it, but to what degree, has what Dan Mullen has done, I guess, kind of, has he done stuff that nobody else could do at Florida? I guess, let me just open it up to you. I'm not even going to angle it in a specific way. But where do you see this program right now being in year 4?
I see it on the upward climb. I don't know that I would say they've recruited good. I don't know that recruiting good is good enough in the SEC. I think that's a league where you need to recruit great, especially whenever you're going against the Georgias, the Alabamas, those types of teams, that have recruited really well. I think you look at even Texas A&M this year, they've been recruiting extremely well. So I think it's going to be one of those programs to where it's going to hinge on development. I think they're going to get a lot of great players or get, some high, recruit, guys that, they went out and battled big boys and, they landed them. I think they'll get plenty of those. I don't think you're going to see them in bunches, like maybe the Alabamas and the Georgias and the Clemsons and all these other types of schools. But I really think that when you look at the guys that, from a development standpoint, I think one of the biggest things to where you can put your trajectory of your program is at the quarterback position. And I think that's what Dan Mullen obviously does a really good job at. I think that they need to continue to land some of those higher guys. I think that, recruiting in the state of Florida, a lot of these guys in the state of Florida have been leaving, to those schools that we've mentioned a billion times that, come into the state of Florida and pluck those guys. I think that you have a lot of these battles that Florida's not winning. They need to win more of those battles. That's not what I'm saying, but I think they've done a good enough job and they develop enough to where they can compete. Is that going to be on a consistent basis? I don't know. Are they going to have teams that are really, really good and some where you kind of take a step back? I think that it's too up and down is where I think I see things going. Granted, Dan Mullen's coached a lot. He's elevated the program. Like we've said, he's coaching well. That's going to win a lot more games and it's going to lose games, whenever you have that X's and O's types of guys. But I think you can take that next step by getting those 5-star players, those high top 100 type of players, and develop those guys. I think they have a really good eye for talent. Some of those guys that are diamonds in the rough type of guys, I think that they see certain things and they've been in the league a long time to know that they can get what they can get out of those guys. They know to recruit to their program that fit what they're going to do. So I think you're going to see them do a lot more with less, but I think that fans want to see them continue to land more of those types of players. So I guess what I'm saying, the trajectory of the program, I think it's going to be up and down. I think this year it has a chance to be one of those down years compared to last year where Florida had a lot of these first round, high talent guys, but it all hinges to me on the quarterback. So I think whenever you look at the future with a guy like Anthony Richardson, who is the future of Florida, I think it's very bright. I think if you can continue to showcase him, kind of recruit guys around him and continue to, elevate certain spots on the roster, I think that's great. And I think Florida will be a lot better in that sense. But I also think when you throw in the wild card of the transfer portal, it's something that really has helped Florida a lot. When you look at some of these star players that they've gotten out of the transfer portal, that's where I think their bread and butter is. And that's where I think that you can kind of overcompensate from recruiting good, and you can mix in some of those transfer portal guys. And I think it kind of equals itself out.
I want to talk about Anthony Richardson in particular because, obviously I haven't had a chance to get your thoughts yet from Saturday on him. And I want to talk about that, but I want to hold off on that until the second half of the show because I want to kind of have our opinions on where the program's at pretty fleshed out by the time we talk about how we would kind of handle the quarterback position going forward. Let me go back to one thing you said. I think it stands out. Florida is going to do more with less under Dan Mullen. I think that's absolutely true. I think you look at the program that Dan Mullen inherited. He takes over a 4-7 team with a quarterback that obviously was struggling in Felipe Franks, and it took him a long time to really build up Felipe Franks, into a quarterback where he could kind of rely on and really win games with. I mean, for all intents and purposes in 2018, that really didn't happen until the South Carolina game, which I believe was like the fourth to last game of the season. So I think that, going from 4-7 to a 10-win team in your first year, that's obviously a clear indicator that Dan Mullen can do more with less. I don't think there's anybody that really disputes that, right? I kind of now am like, okay, so we had year one. You had the quarterback with the broken confidence in Felipe Franks that you had to fix. Dan Mullen did that. You transition, not quite the way you want in year two, but Kyle Trask ends up taking over. You end up having a lot of really, really good skill players. Billy Gonzalez, I think, probably doesn't get enough credit for how much work he did with a group of guys that, by and large, Jim McElwain had as younger players that didn't really contribute a whole lot. Right. So I think the development standpoint, I think everybody's on board with that. It's very clear. I think the question for me, if you're looking at Florida from a historical standpoint, what Steve Spurrier did, what Urban Meyer did, kind of, that elevation of the program over that 20, 30-year period to where we are now, Florida shouldn't have to do more with less. And I think that's kind of where it's hard for me to be fully 100% both feet in the door with Dan Mullen because I do think they need to recruit better ultimately. Like you said, they're going to be up and down. They'll have years where they can, do what they did last year, potentially be on the doorstep of a college football playoff when they have elite talent, when they have a great game-breaking quarterback or, those
types of guys that they're going to have to develop. It's
exactly.
It's very much a developmental program.
So my question is, how can you get now, I guess kind of the next step for the program for me is what I'm trying to say is the next step is consistently being on that stage, right? Consistently being in that zone where Florida was last year for the majority of the regular season, where they're widely considered a playoff contender, and it's going to boil down to one or two big games who comes out ahead in those. For Florida last year, theoretically, I mean, if you remember last offseason, we talked so much about the direction of the program, the trajectory of the program. And we said, Blake, both you and I, that Georgia game was going to be huge because part of the narrative around Florida football, and, college sports is what it is. We live on narratives, right? That's right or wrong. Whether or not one game ties into the bigger picture of a narrative, it probably shouldn't as much as we try to make those ties. But the reality is in recruiting, those narratives are by and large what drives momentum, what drives kind of upward trajectory. If you can have a game like this weekend, like Alabama, where you have a ton of big name recruits in town, and you subvert the expectations, you kind of surpass them or exceed them, or you blow it up and Florida gets destroyed this weekend. Either way, that has an effect on the narrative of the program, right? And so last year the narrative was, if you had lost to Georgia, I think it really would have cemented recruiting as kind of the winner in that tug of war between, can you coach guys up enough to win championships at Florida versus are you recruiting at a high enough level? Had Florida lost that game, right? But Florida goes out and beats Georgia, and I think that pendulum shifts kind of the other way, where you're like, okay, Dan Mullen is good enough to coach against, a more talented team. And again, caveats, let's throw some caveats in there. Georgia's quarterback play was terrible last year. It was before they had gone to JT Daniels. Who knows, whether or not that plays out this year. But bottom line, Florida got the job done and kind of started to shift the narrative in its favor. Problem comes, again, LSU game. You come to the LSU game, Florida loses a game it had no business losing. And, whether or not that's strictly a focus issue, just a completely one-off type issue where, hey, maybe it was a fluke, maybe it was a complete outlier. Whatever that may be in the long run, in the immediate term, it kind of shifted the narrative back to that 50-50, between the recruiting, between is Florida ready to turn the corner? And then you come out the next week and you play Alabama really close. So it's like, I don't know what to make of the game this weekend. I honestly don't right now. Based on what we've seen the first two games of the season, I'm kind of expecting Florida to lose handily. Now, I think the 2-touchdown spread, I think that's about right. But having said that, it also wouldn't surprise me at all to see Florida come out and be really good in this game and be competitive and have Dan Mullen show things that we didn't see in the first 2 weeks, really kind of catch Alabama off guard. And again, we'll go back to the quarterback situation later, but I do think you have the potential at quarterback to really have a game-changing guy such that that talent question starts to fade again a little bit because you have a quarterback, in my opinion, in Anthony Richardson, that at least has the potential, has the ceiling to cover up a lot of those other issues. I guess, Blake, what I'm getting at is ultimately this Alabama game, I think, is not going to mean a ton in the big picture for the 2021 season. In other words, if Florida loses this game, no big deal. They can still play Alabama again in Atlanta. Doesn't make a huge difference. If you go out and beat Georgia, it's still the same thing. I think, the potential comes in where if you do somehow do what I think right now is kind of considered the unthinkable, maybe not unthinkable, but at least improbable, and you upset Alabama, how much, Blake, would that change the narrative around the program and potentially the trajectory of the program? And I guess let me ask you, wouldn't a win against Alabama with a bunch of recruits in town make you feel a lot better about how Florida is going to recruit going forward, or would it not really change your opinion that much?
I don't know that it really changed my opinion. I think that a lot of these kids don't put their decisions off of wins and losses. I think that if you do win, obviously the atmosphere will be electric. Florida will have a lot of things that they can sell to these guys. I think that it'll make a lot of waves. I don't know that in the long run it really changes things because you still have to close things out. Closing has been kind of the Achilles heel for, this coaching staff when it comes to recruiting.
Very fair.
But I do think that it does create excitement. I think recruiting is very much how much buzz you can create. And I think you mentioned that earlier. And I think it's very much a perception type of deal. And I think that that's going to, if you win those types of games, that's going to get guys talking. When you win those kinds of games, even guys that, committed elsewhere, guys that you were targeting on early that, were committed sometime in June or in the spring or whatever they did. Those kind of guys, they give you a second look like, oh, wow, look, Florida did this. I should go look into them more. So I think it creates buzz. I'm not saying that it's not going to do anything because obviously it's going to get guys talking. It's going to get kids that maybe weren't giving you a look before that were watching the game. Hey, I want to go check out Florida. So it's going to do some positives, but I think in the long run, it's not going to change my opinion of the recruiting because you still have to close these guys out. If you don't land a guy, catch a guy with some visit high that commits on your visit, goes out and continues to take more visits and, continues to talk with coaches, you still have to close things out. If a guy's going to take his decision out later, I don't know that that's really going to change my opinion of things, but I do think it's going to create buzz. And I think it's going to give, kind of the coaching staff a little bit of a feather in their hat, if you will, to, pitch these guys, to have something new to talk about to these guys. Say, look, we did this. We did the unthinkable. We took down the number one team. Alabama beats everybody, blah, blah, blah. There's so many different pitches you can make from that. Right. But in the long run, I don't know that it really changed my opinion, but I definitely think it's going to create a lot of positives if that did happen.
All right. Let me approach it this way then. Dan Mullen's in year 4, right? That's fairly well into his tenure. I don't think anybody thinks he's on the hot seat right now. I mean, no. That's ludicrous. Look at the number of games he's won at Florida. He's not on the hot seat. That said, a lot of people do like to evaluate kind of the forward picture, right? Let me pose it to you this way. If Florida comes out and we'll say meets expectations, we'll say the spread's right. Florida loses by 2 touchdowns, maybe competitive at certain points, but it's a lot like last year's game where, for the most part, Alabama led the SEC title game for 2 touchdowns throughout. It ended up being a 6-point game, but for the most part, it never really felt like Florida was a threat to Alabama. Where does the program land at that point in terms of trajectory and more specifically how the fans react to where Florida's at. Because at a certain point, the deeper into a coach's tenure you get, and again, I don't think Dan Mullen's on the hot seat. He's got an athletic director who hired him, who worked with him at Mississippi State. I don't think he's on the hot seat. So I'm not asking for hot seat talk. But if Florida just meets expectations in this game, how much pressure does it add from the fan base? And what's kind of the angle for that pressure? Is it that we have to recruit better? Is it that, Dan Mullen needs to be more aggressive making staff changes? Like, where do you think the fan base settles out if this game goes to expectation and Florida loses by about 2 touchdowns?
I think it's just recruiting better. Again, it's Alabama. It's kind of hard to really pin them on, if they lose to, the LSU game last year, I think is where you really create that kind of talking point. But, with Alabama, I think it's going to be that they need to recruit better. I think if it's competitive and, all these kind of things, I think for the most part, we all know that these coaches and Florida staff have done a good job developing guys. They're really good coaches. So I don't know that it's really a coaching thing. I think the narrative from the fan base, if they did lose and, met expectations and didn't get blown out, it's just that they need to continue to recruit better. You're not going to beat the types of Bamas, those types of teams that, are 3 deep with, high 4-star, 5-star types of players. To beat those kind of guys, I think that the narrative would be that you need to recruit better players to compete with those types of guys.
Is there any skies falling scenario based on this Alabama game? Like, no matter how it goes, is
well,
there any
the fan base,
where...
you never know, man. Like, I think you're going to have some of those guys that will be skies falling, but I think for the most part, I don't think so, but I'm sure you'll have some of those types though, for sure. That's part of a fan base.
Okay. Well, we'll take a quick break because I'm going somewhere with that. And I think the quarterback situation is going to play into a lot of how not only this game is viewed, but how the rest of the season is viewed. And kind of, again, I think the quarterback situation has the potential to keep the program's narrative, the trajectory in a very positive place, depending on how that plays out. And I'll talk a little bit more on the other side of this break about exactly what I mean. Welcome back to the Swamp 24/7 podcast. I'm Thomas Goldkamp here with Blake Alderman. Blake, we were talking about long-term expectations, trajectory for the program, perception versus reality. To be honest with you, a lot of the perception of where Florida's at as a program is ultimately going to hinge on where things are going, right? And we've talked a lot about recruiting being, I think, good. You said good. I would say probably adequate for Florida standards. I think it could certainly be better. And I will say, look, not only did Dan Mullen create more with less when he took over the program in 2018, but he recruited well enough that the bottom of the roster, I think, really shored up. The depth of the overall roster is a lot better than it was.
I would agree with that.
So I don't mean to sound like, the recruiting is so bad that it's the worst Florida's. Like, that's not the case. Okay, Dan Mullen has recruited well. The issue, I think, when we're talking about recruiting, to be very specific so we don't get this unclear, is really, Blake, those top 100 types, particularly in the state of Florida. We're talking 2 to 3 guys a cycle, in my opinion. The borderline 5 stars, the 5.
Even the guys that Florida spends a lot of time on, putting in effort. There's just been so many times where Florida goes out and offers a guy early, recruits him really hard. Florida's my leader, blah, 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 this, and they end up somewhere else. Those are the types of battles that Florida needs to continue to win. In-state, out-of-state, in their bread and butter areas, those types of battles.
Exactly. And so, anyway, I think, you look at what Dan Mullen's done. I think I guess the danger for me is that if you come out and you lose this Alabama game to expectations or God forbid worse, it's going to kind of continue this idea that Florida's talent needs to be a little bit better than it is now. And I don't think that's a wrong ideal at all. However, one thing that can really change that outlook is if you have a program-changing quarterback. It's only been 2 games for Emory Jones, Blake. But I think at this point, based on the quality of those opponents and what we've seen out of Emory Jones in terms of the actual struggles he's having, I'm ready to say right now that I don't think Emory Jones is a program-changing quarterback, a quarterback that can make up the difference in talent, a la a guy like Cam Newton did. If you look back at that 2010 Auburn team, almost no defensive talent went to the NFL. I mean, Nick Fairley, I think, is one of the only guys that
didn't do much.
If memory serves, I think he's the only guy that even got drafted off that defense. So you're talking about that kind of elevation. And maybe Florida doesn't need quite that much, I think the league is a little bit tougher than it was in 2010. But I don't see Emory Jones as that guy. And I think the reason, as I've stated on a couple podcasts now, I think the processing is just too slow. I think he knows on an X's and O's whiteboard. He can show Dan Mullen exactly what's going on, what he was thinking, what was looking at. But at the end of the day, the ball just does not come out quick enough. And I think when you're seeing that kind of problem against the likes of FAU and USF, that's an issue. Now, I know somebody else on the Florida beat kind of made the statement that through Florida's first 2 games, what Florida showed on offense is really only a JV offense, right? And they haven't broken out, so to speak, the varsity offense. In other words, Florida was playing very vanilla, right, the first 2 weeks. And I think we all agree that Florida has not shown all its cards. However, if Emory Jones is struggling with the JV offense, my question is, how in the world is he going to manage the varsity offense when you're also playing against a much, much more talented team in Alabama, an LSU, a Georgia? That for me, so the crux of the issue to me is I don't think Emory Jones is the guy. I don't know that Anthony Richardson is either, but he definitely has the potential to be that guy. So let's talk about it, Blake. Let's talk about the quarterback situation. There's two trains of thought for me here. The first is, obviously, let's talk about Anthony Richardson's hamstring. From what I've been able to gather behind the scenes from speaking to sources, I don't think the injury is very serious. I think it was a very mild strain. Anthony Richardson got an MRI. The results came back, no tear. So I don't think this is a situation that's really going to keep him out. And I think if Florida wanted to play him against Alabama, they could pretty much play him the same way they did against FAU and USF. That's basically what I've been told. So knowing that, Blake, there's 2 trains of thought, right? There's the train of thought where it says, okay, it's clear Emory Jones has these issues, isn't going to be the guy. We were not going to beat Alabama with Emory Jones. So let's try Anthony Richardson. There's the other train of thought that says, okay, it's entirely possible that Anthony Richardson has been awesome. And also, it can be true that he doesn't know how to check the full offensive line of scrimmage, is missing things here and there, like Dan Mullen is saying. And that could still also be an upgrade over Emory Jones. The question is, what kind of long-term impact would playing Anthony Richardson heavily in this Alabama game, maybe even starting him, have on his confidence and his future trajectory? And Blake, I think you can make the case. I don't know what the right answer is in terms of how they split that rep at how they split the reps at quarterback, how you approach Anthony Richardson. But I think those are the 2 trains of thought. And I think how Florida handles it, how Dan Mullen handles it this week, and especially next week going forward after Alabama, is really going to impact the way a lot of fans think about the direction of the program going forward. Am I right on that? Just in terms of, if it seems clear that there's a shift to Anthony Richardson, I think all of a sudden a lot of the pressure from the fans that we're talking about can dissipate a little bit, where you can almost give yourself that extra layer of patience from the fan base if you're Dan Mullen, if it's clear you're transitioning to Anthony Richardson. Am I wrong?
I don't think you are.
So how would you handle this if you're Dan Mullen? And again, we're going to work on the assumption that my sources are right, that the hamstring injury is only a minor deal for Anthony Richardson. How do you approach this game if you're Dan Mullen?
I'm glad I don't have to make the decision, because it really is it's a position to where you're playing a guy that knows more of the offense. It's like, you study for a test and you can get all the questions right when you're studying and looking at your flashcards or whatever. But whenever it comes time to take the test, you don't do as good. You struggle. You don't perform well under the lights. You have that type of situation, which is an Emory Jones type. No, could sit there and draw up what he did wrong on the whiteboard with Coach Mullen. Run through all these things. You can get more of the playbook with him, but he just doesn't perform well whenever the lights are on. At least doesn't seem to translate it as well when the lights are on. Or you've got a guy in Anthony Richardson whose ceiling is definitely higher. You can make those types of backyard football plays if he's missing checkdowns or he's missing things where he doesn't know the part of the offense. But whenever he improvs, he can make something spectacular happen. In my opinion, I think that you should start to transition Anthony Richardson. I think the offense runs crisper with him. He seems more confident, even from footwork, shuffling things. It's dangerous playing backyard football against a team like Alabama if Anthony Richardson really is doing, his own improv on certain things and missing these kinds of calls. I think in the long term, just going forward, whether this season or even into the future, I think Anthony Richardson, it's clear that, he's the future. It's clear that he's going to be the guy that, they think of the world of him, all these types of things. He just has that more of a wow, just play in his game. So I think that you should start to transition more to him. Could you destroy his confidence if he comes out and doesn't perform well against an Alabama, and that could hurt him in the future? Absolutely. So that's where it's really hard, and I understand what you say, to where I don't know that there's really a right or a wrong answer either. My personal opinion, it just seems like things run more crisply with Anthony Richardson in there. Emory Jones just seems to read things way too slow. He's making these throws too late. I think you're going to get the same type of outcome of playing in Emory Jones, to where you could be a 4-loss, something type of team, to where he's just not going to make enough of those plays to get you over those humps in some of these games. Or would you rather possibly have the same outcome with a guy like Anthony Richardson, that you continue to raise his ceiling or even raise the floor up to it as well, to where he can learn more of the offense? The best way to learn things more of the playbook and get more of those, types of game reps is to get them in the game.
Right.
So I think that it's very similar to where you could have the same outcome in a season, but you're working more towards the future instead of kind of spinning your tires on a guy that you're going to, lose some games, but you're not preparing for the future. So I think it's time to start transitioning more to him, not only to get him more comfortable in the offense, to teach him more, but I just think that things just seem to run more smoothly with him in there.
Two things I want to get to. I just listened to that because they stood out to me. You mentioned confidence. I said Sunday on the podcast that I think Dan Mullen is almost playing a game of confidence roulette. And what I mean by that is you're trying to manage the confidence of not just Anthony Richardson, but also Emory Jones. And the question is, I guess, and it seems from the way Dan Mullen's handled it so far, is that Dan Mullen very much, it seems like, thinks he's going to need both quarterbacks this season, throughout the season. Whether or not that's because he's worried that Anthony Richardson's playing style, he could get banged up. We've already seen that a little bit. Or he just feels like they need Emory Jones's veteran leadership in the locker room. Whatever it is, it feels like, to me, one of the reasons Dan Mullen hasn't made a more meaningful shift to Anthony Richardson yet is that he doesn't want to destroy Emory Jones's confidence. And I think I talked about it, and we joked about it via text during the game Saturday. I had written a bunch at halftime about how this was a perfect scenario for Dan Mullen, with Emory Jones suddenly playing a lot better, riding a confidence high. You could go into Alabama with both quarterbacks very confident. Well, all of a sudden, he comes out and struggles with those same issues in the second half, and it's like, now if you're Dan Mullen, you don't want to pull him because then you could ruin Emory's confidence. Should that be a fact? Should Emory's confidence be as much of a factor? Because I think everybody understands the confidence angle with Anthony Richardson, right, in this Alabama game. You don't want to throw him in. All of a sudden, he's seeing, monsters coming at him on the pass rush, doesn't know what to do. And all of a sudden, it's like he's shell-shocked and not the same guy as he was in those first 2 weeks. Everybody gets that angle. I guess the angle I'm asking about is, should Florida even worry about Emory Jones's confidence at this point? Is that a consideration that should be made?
I think so, because I think if you're going to plan on playing these kind of guys, an injury, pull a hamstring or something like that, if he's going to, truly wants to try to incorporate a 2-quarterback system, I think you have to, because if you're going to use Emory Jones at some point, if you're going to continue to point him as the starter, I think you're going to have to keep that in mind, because it does seem like Dan Mullen is keeping his focus in mind on that.
If I had to guess, Blake, I think what we're going to see on Saturday is something like 3/4 Emory Jones, 1/4 Anthony Richardson. I don't think it'll end up being a 50-50. I don't think Anthony Richardson really takes over. And I think that's going to be part of the reason. I think it's going to be both attempting to, somewhat limit Anthony Richardson's exposure to a situation that could potentially set him back, while also kind of getting Emory through to a point where hopefully his confidence isn't too shaken after this Alabama game. But if things play out like they did the first 2 weeks and Florida goes into this Alabama game and nothing really materially changes, I think it's clear at that point that you can make a shift that even Emory can understand. Hey, this other guy's playing a little bit better. We're going to shift to him. We're still going to need you, so stay locked in. But I think that's kind of how you handle it if you're Florida. One thing I will point out, because we didn't do we didn't shoot yesterday right after I reviewed the film. I do think Emory Jones was significantly improved in week 2. And I wrote about this on Swamp 24/7, so if you've already read it, this is going to be a repeat of kind of what I said there for our VIP subscribers. But I think what happened Saturday was Emory Jones got a lot better, got a lot more comfortable. The problem is the gravity of his mistakes, the impact that his mistakes are having an outsized weighting relative to the amount that he's making, right? So in game 1, he made a ton of mistakes, I thought. This week against USF, I thought he made a lot fewer mistakes. And you can look at that first half. After the 2 errant throws on the first drive, he was basically perfect. I mean, the only incompletion he had was that deep corner route to Justin Shorter by the end zone. That Shorter just dropped. So there were far fewer mistakes from Emory Jones. And if you're looking for reasons for positivity to maybe not end the Emory Jones experiment yet, it's that he did show a lot of improvement in week 2. The problem is the mistakes were still absolutely brutal, killer mistakes, right? And that's where you go back to that weighing Richardson versus Emory Jones. Is if Emory Jones is going to make these vital mistakes, that line between where you should shift over to Anthony Richardson, in my opinion, moves up, and it becomes, a much quicker trigger, in pulling the plug on Emory Jones. But Blake, I'm looking down at the clock. We've already gone 30 minutes. We're going to have another episode on Thursday. What we're going to do on Thursday, it's a huge recruiting weekend, right? We don't always talk a ton of recruiting on the podcast because we prefer to save most of that for our VIP subscribers on Swamp 24/7. But we're going to spend the entire first half of the podcast on Thursday talking about how big this recruiting weekend is for Florida. And then in the second half of the podcast, Blake, I think we'll dive more into X's and O's. I'm sure quarterbacks will come back again. But, unless you have any closing thoughts on kind of what we talked about today, I really just wanted to use today's episode to kind of set the stage for what this game means for the program and potentially the trajectory going forward.
Nothing on my end.
All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap it up there, guys. We appreciate you tuning in. If you like this podcast, be sure to hit like if you're watching on YouTube. It helps us spread reach to the rest of our viewers, potential viewers. Hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. You'll get instant notifications whenever we upload a new podcast or a quick hit from me talking about any kind of breaking news that happens. And if you're listening on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Player FM, wherever else we are on the podcast world, be sure to leave us a favorable review. That'll do it for us today, guys, on the Swamp 24/7 podcast. Thanks for tuning in.